Ethan was just a young boy, but life had already been tough for him. He lived in a small, run-down neighborhood, surrounded by houses that were falling apart. His parents worked long hours, but they barely made enough to cover the bills. At school, things weren't any better. Ethan didn't fit in, his clothes were worn, and his classmates often made fun of him. He tried to stay quiet, hoping to avoid the teasing, but it always seemed to follow him. He didn't have many friends, and even the teachers seemed to look right past him. He was a quiet kid, lost in his own thoughts. At home, the situation wasn't much better. His parents argued often, and there was always a sense of tension in the air. Ethan felt trapped. His family was doing their best, but there were just too many struggles, and sometimes it felt like no one was listening. Ethan had dreams, though. He wanted to escape the life that seemed to be closing in on him. But he didn't know how. He didn't know where to start. Every day felt like the same cycle. Wake up, go to school, come home, try to forget the pain. He wanted to believe things would get better, but deep down, Ethan was beginning to wonder if things ever could. One afternoon, Ethan found himself in a tough spot. His parents had been fighting again, and his mom had to leave to take care of something. Ethan was left at home alone, with nothing to do but stew in his thoughts. He felt the weight of his life pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. That's when he remembered something he had seen earlier in the week. A shiny new bike, locked up outside a nearby store. It had been calling to him ever since, sitting there, gleaming under the sun. It wasn't the first time Ethan had thought about doing something to change his situation. His friends had told him that sometimes the only way to get what you want was to take it. At first, he thought about leaving it alone, but the thought of the bike, of riding it through the streets, feeling free, pushed him forward. He could almost imagine the wind in his face, the freedom he would feel. For once, it seemed like he could have something that was his. With a quick glance around, he made his decision. He picked the lock, grabbed the bike, and took off. He felt a rush of excitement as he pedaled down the street, but that feeling was quickly replaced by fear. He had done something wrong. What if someone saw him? What if he got caught? But it was too late now. He was already in it. He didn't get far. A few blocks down, a security guard spotted him. Within minutes, Ethan was surrounded by police officers, the excitement of his escape fading into panic. This was it. His life, which already felt like it was falling apart, was about to change forever. Ethan stood in the courtroom, feeling smaller than ever. His hands were clammy, his knees weak. The judge, a man named Judge Harper, sat behind the large wooden desk, looking over the case. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the sound of papers shuffling. Ethan could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, but he couldn't bring himself to look up. Judge Harper was a man in his mid-50s, with a calm but firm demeanor. He had seen hundreds of cases like Ethan's, and he had a reputation for being strict, not one to give second chances. But there was something about Ethan that caught his attention. He wasn't like the other kids who stood before him. Ethan wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't trying to hide behind excuses. The boy was scared, yes, but there was something else, something deeper. Judge Harper studied him closely, trying to read beyond the fear in his eyes. Ethan wasn't a hardened criminal. The judge could see it in the way he held himself, slouched, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. The kid looked lost. Judge Harper had seen it before. The troubled kid who had given up, the one who had no real direction, but deep down, there was still a flicker of hope, waiting to be discovered. As the prosecutor continued reading the charges, Judge Harper's mind wandered for a moment. He wondered what had brought Ethan to this point. He knew that a decision had to be made, but this time, something told him that there might be more to this story than what appeared on the surface. The courtroom felt heavier now, the tension thick in the air. Ethan's heart was racing as the prosecutor stood and began to speak. His voice was sharp and accusing, painting Ethan as just another troubled kid who had made a bad decision. Every word felt like a hammer, driving the point home that what Ethan had done couldn't be ignored. The theft wasn't just a mistake, it was a crime, and it needed to be punished. Ethan's lawyer, on the other hand, spoke more gently, trying to paint a different picture. He spoke about Ethan's difficult home life, how his parents were struggling to provide, how the young boy had no real guidance at home, and how it had all led him down a dangerous path. The lawyer argued that Ethan wasn't a bad kid, he had simply made a poor choice, one that didn't reflect who he really was. But the room felt divided. On one side, there was the law, the rules that had been broken, the crime that needed to be addressed. On the other, there was the story of a boy who, despite his actions, didn't seem to belong in this place. His lawyer tried to push for a more compassionate resolution, but the prosecutor wasn't having it. The debate went back and forth, the voices in the room rising and falling like the tides. Ethan sat there, barely able to keep his thoughts straight. He wanted to explain himself, to tell everyone that he wasn't a criminal, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was sit there, listening to the arguments, watching Judge Harper carefully. It felt like the world was closing in on him. The decision, he knew, was out of his hands now. The room fell silent as Judge Harper cleared his throat, preparing to speak. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him, unsure whether it would be the end of the line or just the beginning of something else. Everyone in the courtroom waited with bated breath. The judge looked at Ethan for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful, as if weighing more than just the facts in front of him. Then, in a voice that was steady but full of authority, Judge Harper spoke. "Ethan," he said, addressing the boy directly, "I've heard what's been said today. I've heard about your home life, your struggles, your mistakes. I've heard from both sides, and now it's time for me to make a decision." Ethan's mind was racing. He couldn't look up. His hands were trembling in his lap, but he knew he had to listen. This was the moment that could change everything. Judge Harper paused again, and the tension in the room seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, the judge continued, his voice softer this time. "I've seen many young people like you, Ethan. I've seen them make mistakes, and I've seen them pay the price. But I've also seen young people who are given a chance to turn things around, people who just need someone to believe in them. I believe that you can change, that you can do better." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The judge wasn't going to send him to juvenile detention. Instead, Judge Harper gave him a second chance. "You'll do community service," the judge said. "You'll also attend counseling sessions, and you'll have 1 year to prove that you can make better choices. If you succeed, this will not be held against you." Ethan blinked, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. A second chance. It felt like a lifeline thrown to him when he thought he might drown. But with that chance came responsibility. A heavy burden, but one that for the first time felt like something he could carry. Ethan left the courtroom in a daze. His feet felt heavy as he walked down the steps, still trying to process what had just happened. The sun seemed brighter outside, but it didn't make him feel any less nervous. He had been expecting to be locked away, his future sealed in a way he wouldn't be able to escape. Instead, he had been given a chance he wasn't sure he deserved, but one that he knew he couldn't waste. His mind replayed Judge Harper's words over and over again. "You can do better. You can change." But could he? It felt like so much pressure. The weight of it pressed down on him harder than the fear of detention ever had. For a moment, he wished things were simpler, that he could just go back to the way things were before he had done anything wrong. But that wasn't an option anymore. Now, he had to prove himself. Not just to Judge Harper, but to everyone who had ever doubted him. As Ethan walked home, he thought about the community service he would have to do. Cleaning up the park, helping at the local shelter. He wasn't sure how any of it would help him change, but he had no choice. It wasn't just about doing the work, it was about showing that he could commit to something. He had to show he wasn't just a screw-up. The counseling sessions, too, seemed like something out of a dream. Talking to someone about his feelings? Ethan wasn't sure he even knew what to say. But maybe that was the point. Maybe talking was the first step. He couldn't imagine how hard it would be, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't walk away from this. Not after what Judge Harper had done for him. Ethan's thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt and hope, but through it all, one thing became clear: this was his chance to do better. Months passed, and slowly things began to change for Ethan. At first it was hard. The community service felt like a punishment. Sweeping up litter in the park, organizing food at the shelter, it was all hard work, but it wasn't just about doing chores. It was about showing up day after day. And little by little, Ethan began to realize that the consistency mattered. He started seeing how much people appreciated the work he was doing, even though he had only started as a way to pay back his mistake. He met others while doing his service, people who had their own struggles. Some were in a similar situation to his, others had overcome worse. Slowly, the stories of others started to help him see that he wasn't alone. The people at the shelter, the other kids volunteering, they didn't judge him for his past mistakes. They saw him as someone trying to move forward. The counseling sessions were harder. At first, Ethan didn't know what to say. The therapist would ask him questions about his life, his feelings, and it felt like he was digging into places he didn't want to visit. But as the weeks went on, he started to open up. He spoke about his family, about the anger and confusion he felt, about the way his world seemed to close in on him every time something went wrong. And little by little, the weight he had carried for so long started to lift. It wasn't easy, but talking about it made him feel less alone. His grades at school improved, too. It wasn't a sudden change, but the more Ethan worked on himself, the more he cared about his future. He began showing up on time, doing his homework, and even talking to his teachers when he needed help. He wasn't the smartest kid in class, but for the first time, he was actually trying. His parents noticed the change, they didn't argue as much, and things at home began to feel a little more stable. Ethan wasn't perfect, he still had a lot to work through, but every day he became a little bit stronger, a little bit closer to the person he wanted to be. The second chance he had been given was the turning point, and with each step, it started to feel like the first real chance he had ever gotten. One afternoon, while Ethan was working at the community center, something unexpected happened. He was organizing donations when an old friend from his past, Jeremy, walked in. Jeremy had been a part of Ethan's life when things were at their worst. They had run in the same circles, making bad choices together. But as soon as Jeremy stepped through the door, Ethan saw how different he was. Jeremy's clothes were ragged, and his face was tense, as if the world had gotten even heavier for him. He looked worn out, his eyes filled with the same anger and frustration Ethan had once felt. For a moment they just stared at each other, unsure what to say. Finally, Jeremy spoke. "Man, I didn't think I'd see you here," he said, his voice rough. "I thought you'd end up like the rest of us. Didn't think you'd stick with all that community service and crap." Ethan paused, a small, strange feeling bubbling up inside him. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't shame, it was something else. "I guess I surprised myself," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Jeremy shook his head, not understanding. "You've changed. I don't know if I could do what you're doing. It's too hard." Ethan looked at his old friend. He remembered all the times they had gotten into trouble together, the reckless decisions, the mistakes. But now, standing here, he could see it. He could see how far he had come. It wasn't just about the work or the counseling. It was about his mindset. He wasn't the same kid who would have stolen a bike to feel good. He had made choices that led him here, to a better place, and it was starting to make sense. He knew that this was the moment he'd been waiting for. Looking at Jeremy, Ethan realized something he hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't stuck anymore. He was moving forward, and he didn't have to be like the person he used to be. This was his turning point. The path ahead was his to shape, and for the first time, he believed it. Months later, Ethan stood in the same courtroom where his life had nearly been changed forever. He was back to thank Judge Harper. His hands were no longer shaking, and he didn't feel like a kid anymore. He had grown, and the transformation was visible to everyone who knew him. Ethan had stuck with his community service, had kept up with his counseling, and had made progress in ways that surprised even himself. He had started taking responsibility for his actions, for his choices, and had begun to believe that he could shape his future. When he stepped into the courtroom, Judge Harper looked up from his desk, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. The judge smiled slightly, recognizing the change in Ethan. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, but the confidence in his eyes. Ethan wasn't the same boy who had walked in here months ago. He wasn't lost anymore. Ethan took a deep breath and stood before the judge, feeling the weight of this moment. "I just wanted to thank you," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one, and because of that, I'm a different person now. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying every day. I'm not the same person who made those mistakes." Judge Harper nodded, his expression softening. "You've done well, Ethan," he said. "I'm proud of you." Ethan felt a sense of relief flood through him. It was more than just about proving himself to the judge or anyone else. It was about knowing he had done it, for himself. He had been given a second chance, and he had made it count. And in that moment, Ethan knew that no matter what came next, he was ready for it.